We see that there's economies of scope between two goods if it's less expensive to produce them together than it is to produce them separately. So how do we measure quote unquote scope? Well, we're going to define a measure of scope which says the scope between goods 1 and 2 when you produce Q1 units of good 1 and Q2 units of good 2 is the cost of producing only Q1 units of good 1 plus the cost of producing only Q2 units of good 2. So the cost of producing them separately minus the cost of producing them together. And we take that as a ratio with the cost of producing them together. Right? So the first term is the cost of producing them only good 1, only good 2, and the cost of producing them together. So this numerator here is the savings from producing them together. The cost is going to be higher if there is economies of scope. So if it's cheaper to produce them together, then this number, the cost of producing them separately, is going to be a larger number than the cost of producing them together. So this tells us what the savings is from producing them together. And we take that as a ratio so that we have a sense of what's the proportion of the savings. Okay, so if SC, so the scope is 0, then that means that the cost of producing them separately is exactly equal to the cost of producing them together, which means that there's no economies of scope. If this number is positive, that means the cost of producing them separately is bigger than producing them together. So there is positive savings. There are savings to be had by producing them together. So we say that there are economies of scope between these two goods. If the number is negative, it means that it's actually less productive, so it costs more to produce them together. Right? So this is the cost of producing them together, and that's a bigger number than producing them separately. So that means we have diseconomies of scope. So it's worse to produce them together than it is to produce them separately. Let's look at some examples. To look at these examples, we're going to use the concept of a production possibility frontier. What do we mean by that? We're going to fix the amount of inputs. So we're going to say there's a fixed amount of inputs and see how much of the two different goods we're able to produce using those same inputs. And we're going to look at this frontier. So we're going to look at this edge here. We call that economists like to use the word frontier to describe what's on the boundary. So the production possibility frontier is this boundary of all the things that are possible to produce using these fixed inputs. When we have, so let's think of the example when we have apples on one axis and honey on the other. If you have more bees, then to produce the honey, they're good pollinators for apples. And so the more bees you have, the more apples, your trees are going to be better pollinated, so you're going to have more apples. So we have economies of scope between these two goods, honey and apples. So this boundary is bowed outwards. So this PPF, this production possibility frontier, bows away from the origin when we have economies of scope. Now, let's say you could either produce small cars or you could produce pickup trucks. Well, if the same machines can do both, but you have a fixed number of machines, and so your inputs are the same, your capital inputs are the same, you have the same amount of labor, which one you produce, it doesn't really affect. It's not like producing more cars allows you to produce more pickup trucks at a lower cost or anything like that. Well, then, if there's no real interaction between the costs, then this PPF is just going to be a straight line. And so we would say then that there's no economies of scope. So if there's no economies of scope, this PPF is going to be a straight line. An example in the textbook is inpatient drug rehab and outpatient drug rehab as being things that have diseconomies of scope. So when you try to do both, the more patients you treat as inpatients and outpatient, the less productive you are in doing the other. So this PPF is bowed inwards. And this denotes diseconomies of scope. So the more you do of one, the more expensive it gets to do the other, or the less productive you are at doing the other. So this is how these prediction possibility frontiers allow us to visualize whether there's economies of scope or diseconomies of scope